Okay, hello everyone. Let's get started. I know some people are still getting some food and coffee, but we can already get started with some introduction. So first of all, welcome back to this Broad MIT EECS Colloquium. So as you know, in this Colloquium series, we want to highlight people whose work has been motivated by particular applications going into foundations of machine learning. And then, of course, we have other speakers who talk more about how foundations of machine learning are then brought into the biological setting. So today, we're definitely going more in the other direction of having different types of applications motivate foundational developments in machine learning. I'm very excited to have Andreas Krause here today, who is actually here on sabbatical. So if you have more questions afterwards, do come see him in M1 as well. So Andreas is professor of computer science at ETH Zurich, where he leads the Learning and Adaptive Systems group. He also co-directs the Swiss Data Science Center, and he chairs the ETH AI Center. Before ETH, he was a faculty at Caltech for a while, and of course, he has many, many different distinctions. I will just say a few. In particular, he's an ACM fellow, Max Planck fellow, Microsoft Research Faculty Fellow, Kavli Frontiers Fellow, et cetera, et cetera. So very excited to have him here. His research is focused on learning and adaptive systems and how you, in the best way, acquire information and then turn that into reliable decision-making in very complex and very varied systems and application domains. So he mainly works in statistical machine learning and optimization and probabilistic reasoning, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of that today in today's talk. And he's also very excited about getting more into biological application areas and is also here for that on sabbatical. So Andreas, very excited to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Can you hear me? Seems to work. OK, great. Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Thanks a lot for inviting me to give this talk here in this Colloquium series. I'm super excited to be spending a couple months here in Cambridge. And I really am glad to have this opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing in the group. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always eager to talk about potential new collaborations. And before I start, of course, all I'm going to talk about is joint work with a fabulous set of PhD students, postdocs, and senior collaborators who I'll acknowledge as we go along. Probably many of you are excited about advances in machine learning we've seen over the recent years since the advent of deep learning about 10 years ago, the explosion of generative AI in the last 2 years, really enabling breakthroughs from image classification to language translation, to doing things like creating photorealistic videos from textual descriptions and the likes. And we've just started to see the glimpse of what learning-based approaches to AI can do for scientific discovery. AlphaFold is a fantastic example of this, but I'm learning every day about so much exciting work happening here at the Broad at MIT and the environment here in this area. So it's super, super exciting. You would probably also agree that most work in machine learning, at least kind of highly oversimplified, follows this rather kind of linear pipeline where we would start by collecting some training data set, maybe images together with a bunch of labels, then try to learn a model that map hopefully new images to relevant labels. And we would hope that as long as our training data set is roughly representative where we want to use our model, then we would hope for good prediction. And also in sort of generative AI, that same paradigm roughly still holds, except that maybe we don't manually provide supervision, but maybe try to predict the next token in a sentence, and so on. But of course, machine learning only works well if you have data. And the question is sort of, where does the data come from? And that's really a question that's been fascinating me through most of my research career. The question of how can we put machine learning in the loop to design algorithms that actively collect useful information, maybe for the purpose of learning some underlying model or discovering some of its properties, like, for example, enough so you can optimize or control some unknown system and the likes. And so we both look at foundational questions, algorithmic questions. of computational statistical nature in this domain, but also super excited about exploring them in context of a range of different applications. So here's a few of them that we've been working on over the years. So the top left is one application sort of done many years back together with some roboticists and environmental scientists on using kind of autonomous robotic platforms to sample water quality in lakes, for example. So this is the first opportunity during my PhD times to get my hands dirty, or rather my feet wet, on these types of problems. The top image on the top right shows my student Moimir and Johannes, and our collaborator Nicole, at the Swissfell Free Electron Laser. That's a large scientific facility operated by the Paul Scherrer Institute in Switzerland, where we've been using our algorithms in closed loop to optimize the performance of this high-precision scientific instrument. The bottom left is some collaboration between a postdoc in my group, Matteo, and Agroscope. That's a research office of the Federal Office of Agriculture in Switzerland on using kind of experimental design, model-based reinforcement learning to guide experiment design for deciding, say, what crops to grow where, how to manage them, and the likes. But I think one of perhaps most exciting opportunities in this space is to really think about what some people call sort of self-driving labs. So really how to put algorithms in the loop of driving experimentation with increasing automatic robotic laboratory equipment in order to help accelerate scientific discovery. And I understand a lot of people here are interested in these types of questions and very actively working on them. And this also leads me to one of the kind of first examples I want to talk about that motivates some of the work. I'm going to use it a bit of a running example throughout this talk. And this has been about using machine learning for protein function optimization, in particular in the context of directed evolution. And so what would we do? We would take some wild-type protein and then introduce some mutation, maybe swapping out some amino acids with others, such that the mutated proteins exhibit desirable properties. Maybe improved binding affinity with respect to certain receptor molecules, improved catalytic yield for biocatalysis applications, and the likes. And of course, you'd like to close the loop in using outcomes of previous experiments to inform the design of next experiments you want to carry out downstream, along with other opportunities for accelerating learning, like, for example, sharing information across related tasks, or using in silico calculations, and so on. We're going to talk about some of the algorithmic modeling challenges arising in this context. And so here is sort of a highly oversimplified cartoon of the protein fitness landscape. So think about optimizing some performance criterion, like binding affinity with respect to some target that you'd like your protein to bind to. And that varies over the space of possible mutations we can create. And the problem is, of course, we can access this landscape only through noisy experiments, right? Carry out a bunch of experiments to get these noisy measurements. And from those, we'd like to then figure out how should we go about experimenting in order to learn enough to find kind of best performing variants. And so the trouble, of course, is that we don't have a nice analytical form of this underlying objective function, right? You can't compute gradients and these sort of things that you like for optimization, right? The only thing we can do is, in a way, kind of treat it as a black box that we can subject to some inputs, right? A candidate set of mutations to apply, and obtain some noisy measurements, right? That are subject to experimental noise. And these experiments are typically expensive, right? You have to do wet lab experiments and so on. And this is an instance, right, of a much broader family of problems, like black box optimization arises in many other applications. In automatic machine learning, for example, you want to use these methods to guide search for different neural architectures for one that works well in a particular data set. In robotics, you might want to use this to design strategies for tuning gain parameters for controllers, and so on. And of course, some of you want to be data efficient, right? So somewhat quickly converging towards kind of well-performing solutions. And one notion that's often looked at to analyze these types of algorithms is called the regret. That's some sort of cumulative opportunity cost of not knowing what this unknown function is. So here's maybe an important sort of conceptual slide to sort of think about this, again, in form of a cartoon. So in machine learning, we typically look at some data and maybe fit a model to it. And now it's tempting to just use that model to maybe rank alternatives that we might design according to the predicted performance, right? And maybe synthesize them. So the problem is, of course, our model is ever only going to be accurate where we have training data, right? In parts of the design space that are well represented by our training data. But if you think about discovery, we want to go kind of where no one has gone before, right? We want to use a model in places, right, where we don't have data yet, right? That's the whole purpose of discovering something new, right? Maybe go to a part of the mutational landscape that's far away from where we initially started with. That means you want to really use machine learning where machine learning doesn't work, right? Machine learning works well sort of where you have data, but you want, in a way, to use machine learning in order to extrapolate. Right? And so this is, of course, a problem, right? Because there's many possible predictors here that all agree with the training data, but wildly disagree where we want to use the model. So one way to sort of deal with this is to try to explicitly quantify uncertainty in a prediction. And that's what's done in a field called Bayesian optimization, where one really tries to use a probabilistic model to quantify this epistemic uncertainty that's due to the lack of data. To basically endow this black box with a probabilistic model that not just gives us a prediction, but also quantifies the uncertainty in that prediction. And then one can use this uncertainty in order to guide this trade-off between exploration, learning something about this unknown function, and using it in order to do better. And so now in order to do this, there's sort of two main steps. So first of all, we kind of need to be able to quantify uncertainty in a good way. That's really essential. Not just in Bayesian optimization, but in a lot of techniques around sort of active learning, experimental design. That's sort of a key challenge in related paradigms. And then we want to use this uncertainty in order to drive experimentation. And so in Bayesian optimization, this is typically done by some index-based policy, something called an acquisition function, that in a way scores different designs for the ability of navigating this exploration-exploitation dilemma. And so now coming to the first part, kind of this modeling part, the idea in Bayesian optimization is to basically try to be Bayesian about this unknown function, right? So in a way, treat the unknown objective, maybe this fitness landscape, as one out of infinitely many realizations of some stochastic process. And as sort of a Bayesian method, we can condition on data under which the posterior distribution will contract, right? And now, of course, there's many possible models we can potentially use here. So one model is classically used extensively in Bayesian optimization are Gaussian process models. These are particularly nice models. All finite marginals are Gaussian. That's characterizing them. And in fact, all pairwise marginals fully characterize them in terms of their smoothness, in terms of the covariance function. So it's easy to impose prior assumptions saying, for example, I have correlation decay with the distance between my inputs. But of course, there's in principle many other models one can use. And of course, now we're interested in sort of using kind of neural architectures, Bayesian deep learning, and these types of models that maybe are more expressive in certain ways. I'm going to talk about some ways of doing that. And the second question is, how do we operationalize that uncertainty, right, to navigate this exploration-exploitation dilemma? There's many different ways of how to do this that have been proposed. Here's going to be one. And this is kind of a key slide to illustrate some of these ideas. So suppose we've carried out a bunch of experiments shown by these pluses here, okay? And we've obtained kind of our posterior or sort of credible sets, or maybe confidence sets, so frequentist interpretations of this. And suppose the model is well calibrated in the sense that the true unknown fitness landscape, in this blue dashed line here, is covered, right? It's sort of contained within these confidence sets. Then you can apply sort of the following rationale, right? We can get a pessimistic estimate of the optimal value. That's this green dashed line here. And rest assured that the optimum must be somewhere above this dashed line with high probability. It means it's sufficient to sort of restrict our search to this plausible set of optimizers shown in green here, where the optimistic estimates, the upper confidence bound, exceeds this best lower bound. And that's kind of one of the key ideas behind one widely used principle for exploration, namely the optimism in the face of uncertainty principle. Just greedily pick the point that maximizes this upper confidence bound. An idea widely used in bandits, reinforcement learning, and the likes, and in Bayesian optimization takes a particularly simple form. All you do is you take your mean, add some multiple times the standard deviation to basically linearly scalarize exploration exploitation. And turns out for sort of suitable calibration of this trade-off, you can indeed actually show convergence, get regret bounds for that resulting algorithm, and so on. That depends on kind of an information theoretic capacity of this prior. And so here's an early application of this to protein engineering, now almost 10 years ago, some work that started while I was still a faculty member at Caltech in collaboration with Frances Arnold's research group and a former student of hers, Phil Romero, who's now faculty in Wisconsin. And so he designed a kernel function that's designed for this task that basically captures this hand-designed prior intuition that surface mutations to the protein will less strongly affect similarity than core mutations. And that actually gave pretty good fits on this family of enzymes. So these are P450s, cytochrome P450s. and it basically had generated a data set of different variants produced using directed evolution. It used the predicted versus actual thermostability, and not only does it sort of give decent predictions, also nice Gaussian residuals, and so on. And so based on this, they wanted to use the algorithm. Now, one of the issues that we sort of encountered then is the basic algorithm is sequential in nature. Typically, you want to carry out experiments in batches. So there's natural experimental choices of how you parallelize exploration, how do you get sort of diverse batches that sort of explore within a batch, but also converge to good solutions. And that's sort of a topic that we've been studying quite a bit. And so one of these variants they actually deployed in this to design experiments. They had started with 3 parent sequences, created chimeras by essentially reassembling new variants by combining different fragments of them to obtain the first library, used machine learning on that first library to predict kind of which sequences were to do well based on this model. And while on average, these predicted sequences would do better than the ones in this initial library, that was kind of too local of optimization in some sense. But using this more systematic exploration, right, that's done coming out of Bayesian optimization, after a few rounds, they were able to actually find sequences that were significantly more stable than those that they had started with. So this is, I think, one of the first applications of Bayesian optimization to protein design and so on. So since then, there's been lots of really exciting work on sort of using BO both for optimizing for small, large molecules. Now it's a staple in materials discovery in many application domains, in robotics, AutoML, and so on. So here's a recent thing that we've been working on with our collaborators in Basel. This is part of a large consortium that we have part of in Switzerland, the NCCR catalysis. And the overall objective here is to really try to find more sustainable alternatives to common catalytic pathways widely used in industry, but primarily at the moment relying on fossil fuels or rare metals or kind of non-renewable feedstock. And so there, one of the motivations to sort of think about biocatalysis as new types of catalysts that sometimes can be more sustainable and rely, for example, reduce the reliance on rare metals. And here's a particular type of artificial metalloenzyme that we've been optimizing here for catalytic performance. It's often harder to predict than thermostability, so catalysis is a much more dynamic reaction. So they have some pretty nice robotic equipment here. Where we've been screening among sort of 3.2 million candidate enzymes, kind of doing about 100 experiments in parallel, and so designed a bunch of different batches, and in particular really using fairly large-scale parallel optimization and using basically this exploration that's afforded through Bayesian optimization. Not only were they able to substantially increase the hit rate, so basically the probability among the proposed samples that outperform kind of the wild-type enzyme, but also eventually found a variant that's about 18 times better than the wild type for this particular enzyme. So I would say that these are kind of more standard applications of Bayesian optimization. It's very useful technology as is. But of course, now what I want to talk about in the rest of this talk is kind of what are some of the modeling and algorithmic challenges kind of to move forward with this. And so I want to talk a little bit about how can we go beyond sort of hand-designed priors to kind of learning priors from data. I want to talk a little bit about how we can sort of open up that black box and black box optimization through the lens of causal discovery, and how we can go from sort of static settings to more dynamic settings, and lifting ideas from Bayesian optimization to sort of learning control unknown dynamical systems. So that's the plan for the rest of the talk. So let's start with the first one. So if there's one thing that we sort of learned from the success of deep learning is that given enough data, learned representations often outperformed hand-designed ones. And moreover, these representations often are quite general in the sense that oftentimes it's possible to adapt, fine-tune them to related data sets, right? So one classical example, maybe you train an image classification model in natural images with lots of data, and then maybe you can fine-tune it with just a little bit of data to medical images, right? And of course, that's a staple now in generative AI, where maybe you train a large language model on all of the web and then adapt it to more specialized tasks through fine-tuning. And the question is, can we do something like this for Bayesian optimization? Of course, there's many such use cases. So again, just staying here with this running example, instead of optimizing maybe catalytic performance of a particular enzyme on a particular substrate, maybe you want to reuse information from experiments you've carried out, or maybe how that same enzyme did on different substrates, or maybe how even different enzymes did on different substrates and the likes, right? Kind of try to reuse information across sort of many related tasks. And one way to think about essentially this question of how to be more data-driven in this context is this question of, can we sort of learn a good prior from data? And so there's a very natural way to think about learning priors in Bayesian inference, and that's hierarchical Bayesian modeling. That's the classical idea. So instead of having a hand-designed prior and go through Bayesian inference to get your posterior, we would try to step up a level in the Bayesian hierarchy to start with a hyper prior on our parameters and take a bunch of data from related domains to then basically obtain a hyper posterior that then becomes a prior for new downstream tasks, right? And then, of course, hopefully we can adapt using Fourier samples on a new task downstream. That's the basic idea. The question is how to get it to work with neural nets and sort of models that are now used in kind of ML. And so one of the issues, if you just want to apply it, is the following. So most kind of work on hierarchical Bayesian modeling sort of operates on the parameter level. So for example, you might want to fit a linear model, right? So a common linear model, a common mean of your coefficients, and then model sort of kind of per task deviations of that model. So that's typically done on the parameter level. But the problem is, of course, in neural nets, you really want to over-parameterize. You want to use massive parameters, right? And they individually are not meaningful. And so it's very hard to kind of define meaningful hyperpriors on the space of parameters for neural nets. And kind of the standard default is often used, like isotropic Gaussians, for example, often lead to kind of undesirable empirical artifacts. And so what we've been exploiting as an alternative is kind of inference on the function, basically in function space directly, in terms of the predictions of the model, as opposed to the parameter space. Okay? And so it means that we can sort of think about transfer learning or meta-learning in a way as trying to learn something about the underlying stochastic process that governs the distribution of the different tasks that you might see. Okay? Now, at first, this seems like an even worse task. We go to a problem where we need a prior over a lot, but finitely many parameters, to something completely non-parametric, right, where you have infinitely many parameters, right, an entire stochastic process prior. But of course, stochastic processes are fully characterized through their finite marginals. Moreover, kind of all the state-of-the-art techniques for approximate inference in Bayesian deep learning, they basically don't need access to the full stochastic process, right? All they need is the score, so the gradient of the log density, in particular on certain sets of points, typically involved in your mini-batches in terms of where you want to make predictions and the likes. So we could somehow estimate those, then we'd be in business. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. So basically taking a bag of tasks, we want to kind of extract some sort of underlying stochastic process in a data-driven fashion. And so in order to do this, we sort of need to control its marginals. So the one-dimensional marginal, of course, just the distribution of function values at one particular point, right? And we can, of course, look at high-dimensional marginals. Here, two-dimensional marginal at points x1 and x2. And so in the case of the Gaussian process, these marginals would all be Gaussian. But in general, for general stochastic processes, these can be, of course, more complex marginal distributions. And so what you're going to do is we're going to sort of try to estimate them non-parametrically. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use a flexible neural network architecture whose job is to basically try to predict these marginals in some sense. And what we really only care about is the score, right? So the score of this underlying stochastic process. And so for that, we basically use score matching. So that's a technique that's widely used in diffusion models. So it's a technique that doesn't require access to the normalization constant of the stochastic model. So we can directly basically estimate the scores based on samples. And kind of as an architecture, we use a transformer architecture, right? It's sort of the go-to thing. These days, it's a fairly flexible probabilistic model, of course, the backbone between modern language models and so on. So in principle, this is sort of really quite scalable in terms of the architecture. And so this actually works really quite well. So compare in our clear paper across a range of different data sets. Here's two of them. And both kind of meta-learning and non-meta-learning based approaches, a whole range of different meta-learning approaches, also extensive ablation studies. It's quite a detailed experimental study in this paper. So here's two of the data sets. So the first one is basically from the Swissfell, essentially data sets of calibrating this laser. The second one is maybe more relevant here. That's a collection of time series measurements from the intensive care unit. So here, each task is a patient. And basically what we'd like to do is we'd like to kind of learn a personalized model per patient. But of course, we want to share information as much as possible across patients. So what this hierarchical Bayesian modeling does is basically try to find a model that, in a way, describes the distribution of our patients, and then adapts, right, to the models from individual patients. So you want to sort of shrink towards one single common model. And so here's performance both in terms of the prediction error with mean squared error and in terms of calibration, where this really gives state-of-the-art performance. Okay, and so this is, so in general, analyzing transfer. This is a super interesting theoretical question. We've done some work on it. So I just want to give a quick shout out to some work by my student Panyan, who's been looking in more theoretical questions in more restricted settings, more restricted hypothesis classes. But in general, there's a lot of really interesting theoretical work that also I think a number of people here are thinking about, and lots to do in this space. Super exciting. And so here's an application in sort of transfer learning for Bayesian optimization and the task of optimizing over MHC-I molecules. This particular kind of task of optimizing binding affinity of this family of proteins to a particular set of alleles. It's a task that arises in tasks like vaccine design, for example. And so here we take an existing data set. We don't actually carry out wet lab experiments. We play back a data set that was recorded and just, in a way, let the algorithm choose kind of which of the data points to play back with. And here the tasks are basically different targets, right? Different alleles that we want to bind to, that we share information across. So it's basically this protocol that I had described before. And so we both run some algorithms that are basically just standard Bayesian optimization, both with Gaussian process and Bayesian neural network priors, as well as meta-learning-based ones. And they really substantially accelerate the search. So this is giving quite a lot of information of sort of related tasks, but otherwise for a new task, they basically have to learn from scratch. And in a way, you very quickly start to look for promising solutions very early on. Okay, so now to the next topic I want to talk about is how we can sort of open up the black box. So Bayesian optimization, right, in a way, really treats this underlying objective, right, this protein fitness landscape or so, as a black box. We just give some input and get some output. And maybe if you want to kind of engineer high-performing enzymes, maybe it's fine to do so. But for a lot of tasks of scientific discovery, of course, we'd like to understand something, right? And maybe try to find a more kind of mechanistic, more causal understanding of how this black box works. And so I'd like to talk about a particular piece of work on model-based causal Bayesian optimization by Scott, who's actually sitting here in the audience, and Anastasia, a former student of mine. And so here we're going to talk about causal models, basically DAGs, where each variable, basically each circle corresponds to a variable. So the running example might be here, also highly simplified and stylized. So maybe you have a gene regulatory network. Genes affect each other in sort of a causal fashion. And they also have some phenotypical properties of the cells. And now imagine we can intervene, right? Maybe sort of knock down some of the genes in this network and can sort of model the effect of these interventions. That's done in causal modeling through mechanisms, right? So basically, functions that model the blue variable in this causal model as a function of its parents, A and B, the intervention perturbed by some noise, right? This is an additive noise model. Of course, you could have more general noise models. Okay, and so now what we want to ask is kind of how should we intervene in order to maximize some rewards? We'll identify one of these nodes in this causal model as the reward node. Maybe we want to kind of intervene such that the phenotype exhibits certain properties that we care about, and we want to make sure that the genes or certain genes reach a certain target state, for example. And the question is sort of how should we do this if we don't know these mechanisms, which is the typical case in these applications, right? How should we navigate this exploration dilemma in order to learn enough about these underlying mechanisms so that we can then optimize performance downstream? And this is a strict generalization of kind of this Bayesian optimization model. So you can think about classical Bayesian optimization in this way, where you have a bunch of interventions that directly affect the reward variable. You don't get to see anything else. Don't get to model anything else, right? And so here in this model-based causal Bayesian optimization setting, you sort of open up that black box, have a bunch of other variables, right, that essentially model kind of these effects of intermediate variables that are causally related directly or indirectly with respect to the reward node. And yes, this model also generalizes a whole bunch of different formalisms that have been studied in the literature. So how can we think about doing this? So what we want to do is we want to lift ideas from Bayesian optimization to that setting. Okay, and so the way we are going to do this is to basically use a Bayesian model, a probabilistic model, for the mechanisms in this causal DAG, right, for these functions f, right, that not directly describe the reward, but describe effects of how variables influence each other. So if we apply some interventions, maybe on these two nodes here, set them to a certain value, then we can observe the variables in this causal DAG. One of them is the reward, but maybe also observe some of these other variables. And then we can condition, in this particular, there's now this one mechanism that we're zooming in here on the right, but that describes how the blue node is affected by the yellow node through basically this Bayesian model. We can condition on that output, the uncertainty reduces, and that basically informs this, the causal effect that we're describing here. And of course, now we want to use this information and the uncertainty about this mechanism in order to drive experimentation. Do something like GPUCB, this optimistic exploration, but in this more complex setting. And of course, one of the key issues here is how do you, for example, propagate uncertainty across this causal DAG? And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how one can do this in sort of a computationally efficient manner. And so what we describe in this ICLEAR paper is kind of the first algorithm for that general setting that's based on optimistic exploration together with regret bounds that in some cases can be exponentially tighter than those of standard Bayesian optimization. So in particular, in general, for kind of broad class of kernels, there's something going to be exponential, often in terms of the numbers of variables. And here, we sometimes can get away only being exponential in sort of the depth, the length of the causal chains in this model. Okay, and so there's also some experiments. These are on synthetic data, on some instances that have been studied in prior work, where the algorithm performs competitively or outperforms some of the previous proposals for these special cases. And at the moment, we're very interested in exploring potential biomedical applications of this framework. So that's something that we're super excited to think about. I also want to give a quick shout out to Lars, who's also sitting in the audience, who's been doing some really interesting work on uncertainty quantification in the structure itself of this model. So not just the mechanisms, but also sort of the structure itself. He's been doing a bunch of really interesting work in sort of causal structure modeling and so on. So please talk to him as well, and to Scott. Okay, so now this brings me to the last kind of main part of the talk. And this is about kind of learning to control unknown dynamical systems, which is going to be closely related to what we're going to talk about before. So a different way of sort of thinking about these applications that we've described, for example, in this directed evolution context, is to introduce an explicit notion of state. Okay, so you could imagine the state maybe be the structure of the protein. Now we can intervene, right, by maybe applying a mutation, swapping out one amino acid with a different one, and measuring the reward. That's sort of what we had talked about before. But of course, this would affect the structure, right? The mutated structure would be different. Then we could apply a different action, maybe do a different mutation, and so on, right? And can think about this problem of designing a set of interventions really as this sequential decision process, where we really have an explicit notion of state that changes over time. And this arises in many other applications, I would argue, right? If you think about in the cell context, right, maybe you have different perturbations that you can carry out that maybe affects the distribution of a cell states. Or even in decisions like how to treat patients in the intensive care unit, so more broadly, kind of the sequential decision-making problems in medical contexts are sort of this way. And of course, one of the key challenges is that there's a lot of uncertainty everywhere in this model, in particular about this transition model, right? How the next state results from an intervention in the current state. So the applications I'm going to talk about now are not in the biomedical setting. So I'll show you some applications in robotics tasks to illustrate this. Things are much easier to observe and measure and so on. But hopefully, I'd love to talk with you about potential biomedical applications of this machinery. And so many of you have recognized this picture on the previous slide as basically the model behind reinforcement learning of Markov decision processes, a model widely studied in RL and control theory, adaptive control, and the likes. Right? RL is basically this model of this agent that affects the state of the world through its actions and tries to derive some reward this way. And it shares this challenge, right, of Bayesian optimization of trading exploration and exploitation, learning about the consequences of actions by experimenting with them and using what it learned in order to do better. And we've also seen some pretty remarkable advances in reinforcement learning in the ability to scale to very large state spaces, in particular in the context of gameplay and the likes. And so potentially it's a very powerful computational hammer. But Whereas this model is motivated by kind of the agent learning by interacting with the environment. That's really a lie, right? The agent lives in a matrix, right? The agent requires a simulation, right? And if you play Go, you know precisely how the Go board looks once you and your opponent have taken a move. In biology, you don't. In many applications, you don't, right? Maybe you have at best an approximate model. So what you want to do is to sort of get the ARL to work, to use this computational hammer, right, that works as sort of planning and simulation, but being very careful about what experiments to carry out in the real world, alongside of kind of like similar to Bayesian optimization, right? In Bayesian optimization, maybe as an analogy, there you also have this challenge of optimizing the acquisition function. That's a difficult computational problem in general. But if computation is cheap, there's lots of things one can do, lots of heuristics one can throw at it. What one really wants to be careful with is the experiments we carry out. So the question is, how can we do something like this in the context of RL by using kind of this hammer that we have with deep RL? Okay, so basically, how do we get RL to work if we at best have an approximate simulator of the world, or maybe have to learn how the world works from scratch? Okay, and so you can also think about this as a generalization of this model-based causal Bayesian optimization framework, right, with a particular causal model, right, that's given by the Markov assumption. Okay, so here's maybe another intuition, right? So if you think about this, so now think about deterministic systems. So there's no kind of motion noise in some sense. The only uncertainty comes from epistemic uncertainty, so lack of information about the underlying dynamics. So it means even then you have uncertainty about what's going to happen. So if you start in some initial state, maybe cell state or for a robot, and you want to go a particular target state, we carry out a sequence of actions, a policy, we would be uncertain about where we would end up. And this uncertainty is purely, in this case here, due to lack of data, right? Epistemic uncertainty, lack of information about how the model works. So what you can try to do is you can sort of try to quantify that uncertainty, reason about plausible outcomes of our dynamics, and sort of try to come up with a plan that reasonably gets us to the goal. Okay? And now, of course, that's not how the world really works, right? So maybe we end up somewhere else, not at the target state, but we collect some useful information along the way, and our uncertainty contracts. Right? We become more confident about this transition model. Right? We obtain an observation from our Bayesian model. Right? Reduce the uncertainty in this estimated model. Okay? And then, of course, we can use this reduced uncertainty to replan, and hopefully then get closer to the goal. That's kind of the intuition that we're sort of after. Okay, and here's sort of an idea of how we can basically use the standard deep RL hammer, approximate dynamic programming, to solve this kind of task, right? Where we want to be optimistic with respect to this dynamics. So why is this hard? Well, these kind of, if you use neural nets or Gaussian process dynamics and so on, you have very complicated nonlinear constraint sets. Describing them is a nightmare. So you really want to turn this into kind of a form where you can apply standard deep RL techniques. And so here's kind of the simplest illustration that we could come up with. And so basically, suppose we start in our starting state. The y-axis here is the state. This is where we start. And we want to move up. It's the goal state. Okay? This is time. So what we, and again, let's focus on the setting where we have deterministic dynamics right now. So the only uncertainty comes to lack of knowledge about the dynamics, epistemic uncertainty. Okay? So let's carry out some action, maybe given by a policy. And of course, we don't know what the dynamics is, so we have this kind of confidence sets, or credible intervals, where we might end up after one time step. And so now sort of the key idea is to let the agent control its luck. So you introduce a different set of decision variables that in a way let the agent choose where within kind of these plausible outcomes the agent will end up. Okay, so this will construct kind of an optimistic next state. And from there, we can keep going, right? We can, again, ask our policy where they're going to go, where sort of the plausible next states you might end up with. We let the agent choose where it wants to end up in, and so on, right? And this way, we construct sort of an optimistic trajectory that, in this case, reaches the goal. And now, if you look at kind of the underlying dynamics, basically, what happens, we sort of reparameterize the transition model. We sort of enlarge the action space of the agent by letting it control its luck. But other than that, this is a standard Markov decision process now, right? Essentially reformulated kind of the Markov decision process into kind of an optimistic NDP that one can use with standard approximate dynamic programming, policy gradient, whatever methods you like. So you can throw the hammer at it. Okay, so here's some illustrations how that works. Again, so the reinforcement learning hello world task, this inverted pendulum, you want to swing up the pendulum. Initially, you know nothing about how the world works, know nothing about physics. So you think you can just push the pendulum in one direction to swing it up. Of course, you quickly figure out that's not how the world works, but you're going to collect some data sort of near the swung down state. Your Bayesian model contracts, and quickly you learn that you have to swing to one side to gain enough momentum to swing up on the other side. That still doesn't quite work, but you collect more useful data in a larger part of the state space. A little later, you're actually able to swing up, but slightly overshoot because you haven't learned any data on top of the upright position. And just a little later, you basically have solved the task, right, where essentially the optimistic agrees with the real trajectory. Okay, so here's a slightly more complex example. So this is one of the deep RL benchmarks from the Mujoko suite, sort of this half-cheetah robot. It's often used to compare against some of the algorithms that have been used in Bayesian model-based RL. So the PETS algorithm basically optimizes just an expectation over kind of the Bayesian posterior. One natural approach towards exploration is also called posterior sampling or Thompson sampling that you can do. And here, this optimistic algorithm does maybe a little bit better. There's a lot of variability. It's instability in RL. But it sort of does, I would say, at least as well as the other methods. You can make the problem harder by introducing action penalties. So a lot of these applications, you don't want to use too strong controls, right? You don't want to apply too strong perturbations. Don't apply too strong forces. Okay? And so if you do this, the problem becomes harder. Why is that? Well, the agent is penalized of exerting a lot of control and hence sort of encouraged to not explore much. Right? And if you increase it even further, at some point these alternatives, right, that just greedily optimize fail to work, but kind of this reparameterization allows you to sort of still solve that task. Because, right, this optimistic exploration allows you to go further. And so here's kind of what happens. So here's kind of, if you don't use these action penalties, so small ones, then basically you kind of learn by chance, right? But that kind of you happen to move forward by vigorously waving with your extremities and so on, right? Whereas if you use these larger action penalties, this is sort of disallowed, right? Because it's too expensive. So here's some experiment on sort of an RC car that's controlled using a model-based RL algorithm. So the task is basically trying to reverse park. You have to go from here to here. It's not a super complicated robotics task. It's a little tricky because the floor is slippery and the car is moving fast. And so really accurately modeling kind of that slippage and so on is not so straightforward. And so you can use this RL algorithm. Again, if you were to use this from scratch using model-based, sort of model-free techniques directly from interaction with the real world, it's going to take forever. Orders of magnitude more interactions. But here, after about 20 episodes, you basically learned how to do it. This is completely from scratch. You know nothing about how the world works, know nothing about physics. But of course, we do know something about physics. In controls engineering, this is maybe more of what you would do. Right? So the more standard thing to do would be to say, well, let's use physics to come up with kind of a parametric first principle model, and then do sysid, right, to fit our parameters to data, and then derive some feedback controller, maybe use MPC or dynamic programming or something, right, to figure out how to control the system, and then run that system directly on the system, on the device. The problem is that if your model doesn't really match reality, then typically things might not work so well. There's ways to get around this by being more robust, but then that comes at cost of being more conservative, and so on. So typically there's a gap, the sim to real gap. And so the question is now, how can we sort of use the flexibility of, say, neural network models to kind of learn to deal with all these messy effects that are a bit hard to model, while still not forgetting about physics? Okay, and so this is basically something we've been looking at essentially through this lens of theoretical Bayesian modeling. But instead of having a bag of tasks, we have a simulator. Right? In this simple example here, we just use a bicycle model, right? A super simple point mass that we move around with a few degrees of freedom and so on. And what we can do is we can basically generate kind of a plausible set of simulations. And then what we do is we basically estimate the score from the simulator directly to regularize the neural network downstream. Right? So we learn in a completely data-driven neural model for the dynamics, right? That sort of captures uncertainty, but we always push it towards behaving like the simulator does. That's sort of the idea, right? Sort of to roughly agree with the scores of the simulator. Okay, and so if you do this, then even in the first try, you roughly get to sort of the right place. Oops, sorry, we try again. Right, so first time you roughly get there, and then after, I think, about 10 episodes or so, you basically have solved the task, a little before that even, and it sort of keeps improving a little bit further. Basically, even already the very first trials are sort of much better informed. And so here's some quantitative experiments described in the paper. So we compare against this. So this is basically just plotting the holdout likelihood on a test set measured on the actual hardware, using the predictions, using the society approach. So we fit a model on the training data set and evaluate it in terms of negative log likelihood on a test set. And there you clearly see the sim-to-real gap. The uninformed prior initially does really bad, but then does better eventually than the parametric model because it accounts for the kind of slippage in these things. One natural thing I haven't talked about is sort of gray box modeling. So maybe fit the parametric model and then model the systematic deviations from it. And using kind of the simulated prior, you can actually already start better and get to better solutions in this case. And so this is now really closed loop experiments on the actual hardware. And this is basically the kind of a quantitative version of the videos I've showed you before, right? Where using the sim prior in a way you sort of learn much better, much more quickly. Okay, so that's basically all I wanted to talk about. So I think if you really want to kind of harness AI for accelerating discovery, you have to seriously think about how to put machine learning in the loop. And I shared some thoughts that we have in this direction. Of course, this is a super exciting space. There's so much more to do. Some of the questions that I am particularly interested in would be to explore biomedical applications for some of the topics we talked about. And I could imagine there might be some. So we already talked about some in the context of causal Bayesian optimization. But also, I think, in terms of these other questions, like learning to control unknown dynamical systems, and the sim-to-real question, I think, is a very natural one. A lot of biological systems you can simulate. And the question is kind of how to adapt them to experimental data. So very happy to talk about that. And I think the broader question that I think is super important, kind of in terms of AI for scientific discovery, is really this broader question of how kind of we teach our foundation models to sort of know what they don't know. Because if you really want to discover new things, you want to systematically extrapolate, right? You want to use them where you don't have data. It's hard to think about what extrapolation really means in high dimensions, right? As kind of a pirate ship in a coffee mug is that sort of interpolation or extrapolation. But it's still, right? So you know what I mean, right? So it's really kind of, you want to go to places where you systematically don't have training data. It's not even well represented by your training data. Not even use some recombination of concepts you've seen. That means that by nature, the models don't work directly, right? And I think sort of trying to quantify the uncertainty is really one of the grand open challenges in this domain that'd be super important to understand. So I talked a bit about some of these ideas that we've been using, right? That use machinery from foundation models, right? Sort of transformers with score matching, right? Building on some of the ideas that work from both language models and diffusion models. But I think there's so much more to do in this space. So in Switzerland, we are fortunate that our next generation supercomputer in Lugano is going to come online in the near future with a sizable number of top-of-line of GPUs. So hopefully we can do some more serious applied research in this context as well. But I think there's many important methodological challenges as well. So here's the reference. I think it's recorded if you want to look at them later. And I'd like to end by thanking all the collaborators. It was really fun to do all this research with them. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for a really wonderful talk. OK, so we have some time for questions. So either you can come all the way there if you're on that side, or I can run around with a microphone if there are some questions.
Thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering, what are your views on latent space Bayesian optimization? So where BayesOpt is run on perhaps the latent space of a generative model, because or even in general, where you want to project your inputs down to some sort of smooth manifold and kind of run BayesOpt. Like, what are some of the pitfalls of actually doing that?
Absolutely. So thanks a lot for that question. I think it's very complementary to what I've talked about before. There's various different ways of parameterizing covariance functions. One can use these types of models as one of the architectures in the setting that we've discussed here. The challenges I see, if you just get point estimates for your latent space, is you'll exactly find this sort of pitfall, right? You'll learn good representations where you have data, but you can't sort of quantify uncertainty in the representations themselves. I think that's sort of one potential shortcoming that I wouldn't see an easy way to get around. Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. So I just wanted to clarify a couple of things about the RL for dynamical systems. So on the question of this optimistic move in the uncertainty space, without any prior assumptions, this could be the whole state space.
Yes.
And so then you just, every step, you're just moving arbitrarily in the whole state space.
Absolutely.
So then there are quite a bit of other information that was added so that the uncertainty actually is shrinking from one step to another step.
Absolutely. So, I mean, maybe the answer is, so Bayesian optimization is only as good as the prior.
Right, okay.
Right?
So,
and so in a way, right, if you have nothing but an isotropic prior based on distances, so it's hard to kind of get Bayesian optimization to do better than things like random search and so on.
Right.
Same here, right? So typically, it would at least be some assumption about smoothness, right? Some assumptions about boundedness, right? Maybe you have some idea about Lipschitz constants of the system that in a way find their way into the prior. But absolutely, right?
Okay.
But the hope is then, right, by being able to learn better representations from data and the uncertainty attached, you can take advantage of them.
and so I was curious actually at the inverted pendulum example because that example is actually unstable. And so the question is, did you train it under different perturbation models? Did it detect the instability or just stabilize it as a marginally stable system? Right, because I mean, this is one of the most difficulty in these situations, right?
Sure. So we haven't looked at stability specifically in these experiments. We've done actually quite a bit in terms of stability analysis that explicitly makes use of the uncertainty in the predictive models. We've done some work where you can, for example, use Lyapunov functions to certify decrease condition of a Lyapunov function with high probability among all plausible dynamics. So very happy to follow up offline to tell you a bit about some of that. So very interesting question. So more broadly, so I haven't talked about that. So optimism is one side of the coin, right? Optimism is useful for experimentation. But kind of if you think about safety critical applications, maybe you shouldn't be too optimistic, right? Maybe you have to be pessimistic about possible dynamics. And there's sort of a flip side of everything we're going to talk about that's really about sort of constraining safety of exploration, stability analysis, and these sort of things. So there's a whole separate line of work that we're sort of making use of kind of the other side of the confidence bounds.
Great,
Happy
thank
to
you.
follow up.
So I found the simulation question very interesting. So their simulation, instead of priors, you could connect that to the first part where you had multitask.
Yes.
So how much does that help? And then you, now because you're simulating, it's cheap.
Yes.
So you could simulate on many different tasks.
Yes.
So how do you design the right tasks,
Sure.
for example?
Absolutely. So in a way, what we do there, there's sort of two choices that go into the algorithm. Of course, I didn't get time to talk about it in more details. So one is kind of what's your distribution of simulations. So typically, you have to randomize over different parameters and so on to sort of construct plausible simulations. And the second is kind of where do you regularize, kind of what are your marginals, where your measurement sets, and so on. And these are sort of application-specific choices that, of course, do affect the performance somehow. On the other hand, the idea here is that there's not actually a fixed set of tasks that you simulate and keep fixed, but in a way, you only need this regularizer, in a way, for every step of gradient descent, right? So basically, kind of, essentially how these approximate inference techniques work, they're gradient-based techniques, right? Functional Stein variational gradient descent is, for example, what we use. You optimize with different particles that approximate your posterior, and somehow there's a term that's basically the prior score. That's sort of where this appears. And that we just estimate on the fly, right? So in a way, you have a different set of simulations every round, sort of like a different set of data augmentations every round in some sense. And in principle, you could combine this, right? So if you have both kind of related tasks and simulations, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to use both.
More questions?
Thanks again for a great talk. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the hierarchical models that you're using, and in particular, are you learning things like local or global regularity of the surface? Is that one of these hyperparameters in some sense? And then on the other hand, when you were doing these physics regularized models, are you essentially learning how bad the physical model is and how much to trust it? Because you have to decide how to weight those things. So is that part of the hierarchy?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So there's two things we've done in terms of the hierarchical modeling. So the one is to kind of use an explicit stochastic process prior, like a GP, to kind of regularize the meta level. And so that has the advantage that sort of GPs have very interpretable uncertainty, right? Sort of kind of close to your data, you're confident. As you move away from your data, kind of uncertainty goes up. And so that is kind of a fairly interpretable hyperprior that you can use to regularize towards. What I talked about here is something completely non-parametric, right? Where you basically really learn the score of the underlying process, right? The score that sort of agrees with this distribution of tasks, right? And the corresponding marginals that you look at. So you don't make any sort of Gaussian assumptions, necessarily any smoothness assumptions, length scale assumptions, and so on. It's really determined kind of the tasks, at least to kind of first approximation.
In principle, if you have a regularity assumption, then there is a parameterization of finite parameters, which is very, very close to the original distribution, right? I mean, you have a nice function in a compact set.
Yeah.
And so, it'd be written like a polynomial with a certain parameters, right? And so you instead have gone into a complete non-parametric structure on the x. Sure. And I can live with only 10 parameters in the theta. And the question is, I like it, but the question, how much am I paying for this?
So the question is pay statistically or computationally?
No, computationally.
Right? So computationally, I think the methods are pretty similar. It depends on the particular score estimators that are being used. But in some sense, I think the score network, of course, has some inference costs, right, to evaluate sort of the transformer architecture. But in principle, that sort of condenses everything you need to know about the score, right? So it's just a matter of kind of how you train it. So otherwise, you have to sort of evaluate the margins of a GP. That's in principle, so if you do exact inference in Gaussian processes, there's a cost that's cubic in size of the measurement set. Of course, there's various techniques of accelerating these types of computations that one can take advantage on. So if to really have a careful attribution of computational cost, that's not something that we spend a lot of time on this work. I think if you wanted to really scale this up to massive problems, absolutely, that would be important to look at. So the primary focus here really is sample efficiency. So say computation is cheap, so to say, right? We can do introspective planning, but whatever we employ, whatever experiments we want to collect, rollouts we do on a real system, we want to be really careful. So
how do you know that this is more sample efficient than, say, characterizing the underlying parameter space? I'm sorry, I missed that, right? So, in principle, I could have, if I have enough smoothness properties,
yes,
I can get away with a small number of parameters.
Yeah.
And then I can do your extrapolation, like a multi-arm banded type
sure,
thing to sample fairly efficiently in a small parameter space.
Yeah, so the current question is kind of, what is small dimensional parameters? So for these kind of, so in principle, one can do explicit feature constructions, right? So maybe cover the RKJS using Gaussian quadrature and these sort of things, right? To construct explicit basis functions. And then sort of their complexity depends on the fidelity that you want and so on. So that one can do, but there's constants that really blow up exponentially in the dimension, and you always pay for them if you go that way. But here, in a way, somehow neural nets somehow seem to do well with the curse of dimensionality. No one really knows why, right? Of course, it depends on what data you actually observe and so on, and you somehow benefit from that, of course. But analyzing this carefully theoretically, there's many open questions.
Thank you. So one more question. Let's do the last one.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Can you comment a little bit more on the personalized model for each patient and the potential interesting applications?
Sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So the setting that we had there looked at there basically is kind of in a way hierarchical Bayesian modeling for time series, right? But using neural networks dynamics models. So in a way, for each patient, we learn an autoregressive model, right? Time series model, parameterized with a neural network, and we shrink towards a shared common model, right? So in a way, that's kind of what the hierarchical model does, right? It's very much like hierarchical Bayesian modeling for classical linear regression, right? You would have one shared set of coefficients for your variables, and then you have some deviation, right, per task, per patient, say, right? And then maybe an autoregressive model, and you sort of would shrink, right, towards that with regularization. It's kind of the same idea, but getting it to work on really sort of massively over-parameterized models.
Thank you, Andreas. Let's do more questions directly to you. I think we'll be here for another half an hour or so before we head out. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for a great talk.